I started out in the Army with an ROTC commission in 1940. I was in the Coast Artillery Corps, and I went to Panama for 2 years. I was down there when war was declared on December the 7th of 41. I came back from Panama after completing my tour and took pilot training, switched over to the Air Corps, and then remained in the Air Corps until the Air Force was formed in 47, and I switched over to the Air Force and remained with the Air Force and retired from there in 1965.
Long time.
Right.
How old were you when you first went in?
I was just 21 when I got my commission. At that time, we had to be 21 before you could get a commission. And I was 21 in January, got my commission in June of 1940.
Where'd you go first?
Forgot what?
Where did you go first?
For the first, we volunteered. There were a number of us that had graduated, and we volunteered for active duty in 1940, which things were kind of getting a little bit warm overseas at that time in Europe, and we felt that possibly we would be involved in a congregation in the near future, and felt it was better to get started, so we volunteered. And we went to Fort Monroe in Virginia, where I was there for about 8 months before I went to Panama.
And then from there?
Well, when after pilot training, and we did move around in 3 different places again. Back then we had primary, advanced, or primary, basic, and advanced, each at a different base, and then we had familiarization with the aircraft we were assigned to, so we were in 4 different places. And then I joined the 316th Troop Carrier Squadron, and we moved around to a number of bases in the CONUS, in the continental United States, for training. We went to Alliance, Nebraska, and then we went to Sedalia, Missouri, which is now Whiteman, and then from there to Camp McCall in North Carolina. And we were there for about a year in training with dropping paratroopers and towing gliders, and then we flew our airplanes overseas to Hawaii at that time.
What was your training like? Can you describe it for me?
Well, it was fairly routine, really. We did a lot of dead reckoning. Again, we didn't have the navigation equipment that we have at the present time. Very rudimentary, and we did have navigators on our aircraft sometimes. And so we did a lot of cross-country work where we would go from place to place, and then we, as I mentioned, we did do a lot of parachute dropping and towed a lot of gliders, again, to become familiar with how the Army operated with the paratroopers and the people that were riding in the gliders. And again, we were all training at that time, I guess, to go to Europe, but the situation by the time we got ready to go overseas was such that they needed us in the Pacific, and we did end up in Hawaii, where we were again doing training, just normal flying there, and then started carrying cargo down to Guam and Saipan, Tinian, and again training to go in for the invasion of Japan, which we didn't have to do, fortunately, because that would have been a pretty bad situation. I think much worse than the people had in Europe. But I was there on when the Japanese surrendered, and I took an airplane up to an island in Japan, and I've never been able to figure out exactly where it was, but we picked up about 4 Japanese generals and 2 or 3 of their colonel aides, and brought them back for a surrender, not on the Missouri, but to another general. And that was really about as close as I came to any type of fighting, but I do remember that one, because when we flew into the airstrip. It was a Japanese airstrip. There were American planes, crashed airplanes that had been shot down all along the side of the runway. And when we opened the back door, all the Japanese were there with their rifles at forward arms, and we, of course, were heavily armed with our 45s because we were flying C-47 aircraft. And we weren't exactly sure whether they'd gotten the word that everything was all over or not, but as the crew chief opened the back door, this Japanese guys came up and said in perfect English, "Welcome to Japan." And we found out later that he had had training in gone to school in the United States and was very fluent in English, so we didn't have to worry anything about it. But it was a little bit tense there for a while, knowing just exactly what the situation was and whether the people had gotten the word that we weren't fighting anymore. Earlier in some of our trips that we did make down to the forward area, we would kind of go to some of the smaller atolls in the Pacific where the Japanese had been fighting, and the natives that would capture them and then sell them to the United States, and we would pick these people up and bring them back to Honolulu to be incarcerated there. We did that 2 or 3 times, and most of the ones that we brought back were just scared to death. They were little young kids, and one of them I think was about 14, and most of the rest of them were 18 and 19, and they knew they were going back to be killed or something or other like that, so they were just petrified. But we did bring them back. They had no trouble with it, but we had kind of an empty airplane, so that was one good thing we did coming back. The rest of the time it was just pretty much normal routine flying with a load of cargo to offload in the forward area, which the equipment that we were ferrying down was needed in a hurry, and we could get it down there by air rather than sending it down by ship.
Could you describe for me a typical day of your time in the service?
Well, really there wasn't that much to do if we weren't flying, of course. We just I did kind of study the tech order and things like that, and just sat around and talked, basically. It was not exactly dull, but it wasn't anything very exciting or anything of that nature. And we again were in Hawaii, and even though everything there was pretty much blacked out after dark, you could go to the city, and they had some nightclubs and so forth that you could go to, so we could do that.
When you were training, you said, you know, we knew we were training for this invasion of Japan, although it never happened. Mm-hmm. Tell me what it's like being with these other men, training for something like that, when you know that if you get in there, the casualty count is going to be very high.
Well, it was just sort of a normal routine situation that we would fly in formation and things of that nature. And we didn't drop any troopers when we were in Japan because we'd had all of that training back in the United States, and I would say over the time we were at McCall, we probably dropped maybe 2,000 or 3,000 troopers at about 20 of them at a time. So we'd had a lot of experience at that, and again, the gliders that we had towed, we were pretty well versed in that. So we were just basically keeping the airplanes there so that they would be ready to go into Japan, into the forward area, rather than bringing them all the way from the United States.
What about the relationships that are formed at a time like that?
Well, it's really has developed over the years, because we do, as a matter of fact, within the last month, we had about our 18th reunion. We have a reunion every 2 years where a number of us get together, and we were in Las Vegas this time, and so the squadron people, some of them still get together every 2 years, and they do have some personal friendships where they visit, because most everybody is retired at this point. We lose a few each time we come back, but there are only 16 of us this time, and but we do get together and have that camaraderie every 2 years.
When you're 21, 22 years
I
old,
was 21 when I first went in service. Yeah.
training for something like this, does it occur to you that the person sitting next to you isn't going to come home?
No, it didn't really, and I was very fortunate again. I say we didn't really get into any combat per se, but we didn't lose anybody in all the time I was in the squadron. From the aircraft accident, we had a couple of people who died from natural causes, but we didn't have any major aircraft accidents that I can recall. We did have a few wingtips and stuff like that, but these were not major anything. So that really didn't enter into the situation as far as I was concerned anyway. We didn't really think about that. The flying that we had was just basic routine flying. You got in the airplane and flew from point to point, and that was about it.
And what were you taking from point to point?
Well, we had some wing tanks that we took down one time, and just various supplies that were needed in the forward area they would have an aircraft that would need a part that couldn't fly, and they needed to get it down there in a hurry. So, as I say, rather than putting it on a ship and sending it down, which took 10 days or so, we'd fly down in about 2 days. And again, we couldn't make the trip all in one time. We had to kind of island hop and spend, we had to remain overnight at various places on the atolls because of the flying limits that we had. And thank you. And so we didn't really have any problem with that. I mean, as I say, it was just kind of really dull routine that you got the airplane off and felt that the supplies were needed and tried to get them there as rapidly as we could. And then coming back, of course, we were always empty because there wasn't anything to bring back, and we did start to again go to some of the other atolls where we had a few people that were there, and the GIs had finished their tours and were desperate to come back, but they had to wait for a ship to come by, and the ship would be 3 or 4 or 5 weeks late coming in, and so they were real anxious to get back. So we put them on our airplane and bring them back to Hawaii, get them that far anyway, and we did that quite a number of times again to fill up our seats that we had. And they were very appreciative. We always got an extra jug of wine or something like that.
When you would get back to Hawaii, what would the mood be of these folks getting off your airplane?
They're pretty happy to get back because they've been out there and, on some of these atolls, and it's amazing how small the atolls are. I know I still can't, in my own mind, you would read about the fighting that went on in Kwajalein, for instance, and then when you flew in there after the island had been secured, or the atoll had been secured, see how small it was, and you just wondered how there could be that many men so close together, because you could almost throw a baseball across some of the places, and where there had been thousands of people fighting in that area, and they must have been toe to toe really, and just is very difficult for me to visualize that type of fighting on the ground. And I'm sure that it was exceedingly difficult, and everybody was pretty scared, I would think, because there they were dropping like flies, and but we just didn't have that problem really. We weren't, everything that we went into, well, they were still doing some fighting at the end of Guam when we were in there, but basically everything else had been pretty well secured when we went in.
Even knowing that pretty much things had calmed, Did you ever have occasion to not know exactly what was happening and go into a situation kind of blind?
No, we didn't really. The only time we did have any problems, I said, when we went into Guam and they had us take off our wing because they had snipers out in the end of the island and they were looking to shoot pilots, and so they didn't want to identify us that way, and then everybody else was in flight suits, so they couldn't tell who you were, and so they did have to do that, but that was about really the only thing. Some of when we would again stay overnight there for crew rest, some of the guys would go up in the hills and look in the caves and things like that. But I wasn't too interested in that sort of thing. I guess I'm a little bit chicken or something. I don't know.
You mentioned that. Please go ahead.
Okay.
You mentioned the day of the surrender, and you went, and you weren't sure everybody was aware of that. But can you, for those of us who weren't there, can you tell me what that day felt like?
Well, everybody was relieved because we hadn't really been given any direct orders or anything about going into Japan. It was just kind of because they were all pretty highly classified at that time. But we had been told that we needed to keep the time down on our engine because when the engine gets so much time on it, you have to replace it. And so they didn't want to do that. They wanted to have fairly new engines so that there would be more chance really of getting in without having a failure. And so we knew that something was going to happen, but we didn't really dwell on it, if you will. We knew we had to, when the time came, we would have to go in, but we just didn't dwell on it that much, really.
So the day you figured out that wasn't going to happen?
Well, we were all pretty happy about it, that the next thing we were concerned about was, well, let's get out here and go home, that was basically what everybody was thinking about at that time, and you had to have so many points to get home and go back to the States, and the people that had been there longest, of course, got to go back sooner, and I was one of those, fortunately. And the squadron that I had been with, I was the operations officer at that time, and they moved the squadron down to Guam, and I stayed until they had everybody down there, and then I came back to the States. But they were living fairly primitively, and they had to fix up the area. That's what took a lot of time, fixing up the living quarters and things of that nature after they moved. And again, there's very little to do. You can sit around and play cards and things of that nature, but it got to be really kind of boring, really, and there just wasn't anything else to do except to stay with the people that you were with.
You mentioned a few times, we thought we were training for this, or I didn't know where we were going. I think sometimes people, really need to know, really want to know what's happening. What's it like living, wondering, is this what's happening, or I don't know what's happening, and just having to follow the orders?
Well, it's just sort of a day-to-day situation. You try to establish some kind of a routine where you do exercise, and then you eat a lot, and just find something to do is basically the big problem, and it's really rather boring just to sit around like that. And I know when I was in Korea later on, we had a tremendous problem there because we didn't have any airplanes on the air base I had, and the guys were there 24 hours a day, and they had maybe 5 to 6 hours of work, and you could only sleep so much. And so what do you do? Well, you sit around and get drunk, and that's not good to just sit around and do that. But that happened to a lot of people, really. And I think the boredom was probably the big thing, really.
Now, how long were you in Korea?
I was there just about 11 months total.
And is that pretty much what you were just saying? Does that pretty much characterize your time there?
Yes, I was there again when the armistice was signed, and let's say I had an air base with no airplane, but we were keeping the air base open. We had the 5th Air Force Survival School there, and all the crew members had to go through the survival school, which lasted a week for each of them. And then we were also keeping the airfield open for air evac. The air evac from the MASHs would bring the wounded in. We had an evac hospital, an Army evac hospital about 5 miles away. And they would take them down there for triage, and some of them they could keep there, and the rest of them they sent on to Japan. And so they had to have an airstrip to go in and out, so that's basically what we were doing, was keeping the airstrip open. And that was exceedingly boring there because, again, there wasn't that much to do, so you just kind of had to make work, really. Korea, I put in a swimming pool, and I put in an outdoor movie theater, and even though I was the only one that had a car, but I had a Jeep, but we did put up a big screen, and
what did you show?
And some of the dullest movies I think I've ever seen. We had one series that was called Man Against Crime, and I forget who played in it, but it was a series, and it was pretty bad stuff, but it was something to entertain. We had it every night, so that again took up a lot of time. We had a lot of USO shows again, which were not really the best of talent that I've ever seen, but we did have some
Anybody I might have heard of?
Well, we did have Kenny Singleton. I don't know whether she's probably before your time, but she played Blondie in the movies, and Susan Zanuck, who was Daryl Zanuck's daughter, she was there, and Terry Moore. We had Terry there, and those were, I think, probably the biggest. We were kind of isolated. We were a very small base, or only 129 people on the base, but so they just sent kind of the second and third class shows in for us to see.
How did you get your information about what was happening with the war where you were?
Oh, we had radios and everything, and they had Armed Forces radio for us to listen to, and they kept us pretty well advised. That was basically the only way. We did get dispatches through from the Air Force headquarters in Seoul, but mostly by radio and things of that nature.
Keeping in mind that this is an educational tool, what do you think people, whether they're educators or students, should know about the service that you and many others have done for the country?
Well, I think it's a necessary situation. I've had an exceedingly good career. After all the other things, I switched over when I came back from Korea. I switched over to research and development, and was here for 6 years, and that was exceedingly interesting. I think there in the research part of it, you can keep busy all the time.
What kinds of things were your focus there?
Pardon?
What kinds of things were your focus?
My main interest was in life support equipment, which is personal equipment that the pilot wears, like helmets and oxygen masks, flight suits and things of this nature, and all of those were developed here at Wright Pat, and we worked very closely with the users, people out in the operating commands, to try to meet their requirements, and they would come in and use our clothing designers as well as contractors, and develop the equipment, and then send it out for the user to test, make changes if he desired those, and then we would put them into the inventory. And this was something that where you could see what's happening day to day, and not like if you were working on aircraft brakes or something like that, or tires, where, I would think that would get pretty boring. But working with people, it was a very interesting career.
Some people, speaking of career, some people went in, and when there was their time to get out,
Yeah.
they got out. You stayed in for a long time, and then, as you said, you were helping people even after that with the research and development. What has that meant to your life?
Well, it's meant quite a bit to my life, and again, even now that I'm not in the life support business, I'm working on C-130 airplanes now. In all of the publications where they do show pilots and the movies and everything, why they have equipment which I was responsible for getting into the inventory, and this is really quite a little warm fuzzy, if you will, for me to think that I was responsible for getting all this equipment in. It's still being used after probably 10 to 12 to 15 years. And I feel that we've saved a lot of lives. We've made flying much more comfortable than it used to be, safer than it used to be, and things of this nature. So this is really, as I say, kind of warm fuzzies to know that we're responsible for this sort of thing.
Do you think there's anything else that people today or people in the years to come need to remember about the folks who served?
Well, I don't know. I think there are a lot of history books around that have been written. A lot of people have sat down and written their memoirs, and people studying those, I think, can get a better idea of what it is and or what it was, and can kind of build on that to know where their life should lead them, and if they're interested in that kind of thing. Again, I think, like most jobs, that there are times of elation, and there are times when everything's just dull or heck. And you try to get as much elation out of it as you can, and keep busy doing the things that you feel you're responsible for and that need to be done. But there are dips, again, when there just isn't that much to do. But as I say, I think that's probably true, and not only in the military but in civilian life also.
Why did you spend so much of your life in service to this country?
Well, I've enjoyed particularly the life support part of the effort that I've done. And after I retired, I came back and worked as a civilian, which I still am. And I was in life support for some 30 years altogether. And just recently, we attended there's a international organization called SAFE, which is sponsored by the military and industry working together. And it's a rather large organization. They have about 1,700 members, and we just had our national convention, or national symposium, where they present a lot of papers down in Jacksonville, Florida, and I attended that one and was awarded a honorary life membership in the organization for the past work that I had done. And I felt somewhat elated over that, because, as I say, there were 1,700 people that they could have chosen, but they did pick me as one of the two. And it was very interesting work, again, because the fact that you can see really what you're doing, the end results of your labors, if you will. And it was something that I enjoyed, that type of work, and was able to use some of the past training that I'd had, and then working with other people who had had different types of training, I was able to pick up additional things to assist me in making the decisions that needed to be made on which direction to go.
If you could pick an experience, whether it's a moment or a day or a kind of concept, is there one thing that, whether we've talked about it or not, that just stands out in your memory as, you know, part of your service?
No, I don't think so. It's been not exactly routine, but it's been interesting things day to day, but I don't think there's been anything that's been real outstanding. And it's just kind of been everyday stuff, and just can't think of anything that would be really that, well, I mean, where he shot down an airplane or something like that.
So you feel like we've covered pretty much of your experience?
Right, yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions you might have that I haven't?
No, and I was trying to think.
Okay, then I think we're good.
All right.
Thank you so much for being
Okay.
here. It's just a pleasure.